The US military has confirmed it will begin implementing a blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports. The US Central Command said the blockade would begin at 10 a.m. US Eastern Standard Time on April the 13th, which is midnight tonight Australian Eastern Standard Time. Now, the blockade will be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, the Post on X said. For some analysis on how this blockade might play out, Don Rothwell is a professor of international law at the Australian National University, specialises in the law of the sea and joins us this afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Hello.
Just explain to those of us who are not across what this would look like, what actually is a naval blockade?
Well, effectively, it's an attempt by the United States to use its military assets, principally its navy, to really stop vessels moving in and out of Iranian ports. And that's a very important point of distinction as opposed to the Strait of Hormuz, which is a different situation altogether. So it's really an economic measure of warfare, a legitimate economic measure of warfare that the United States is seeking to impose.
So when you say legitimate, a naval blockade's like the one that we know about. We haven't seen its execution yet. That begins at midnight our time. But this blockade, is it legal under international law?
Yes, the law of naval warfare acknowledges that it's possible to impose a blockade on states during an armed conflict. And of course, we have an armed conflict at the moment between the United States and Iran. And at one level, the announcement of the imposition of a blockade really brings to an end any notion of there being a ceasefire, to my mind, because that's really a resumption of hostilities between the United States and Iran.
Well, that's just a bit confusing for me, because if it's legal and the US has agreed to a ceasefire for 2 weeks, they are violating that ceasefire, are they not?
Correct. And so, at one level, it's really no different to the way in which we had the debate over the last few days about ongoing Israeli strikes in Lebanon. So what exactly is or is not included within the ceasefire? But certainly on the terms of the ceasefire, as it was announced late last week, it certainly didn't include the United States seeking to blockade Iran. So I think the Iranians would very much take the view that if the United States did move to impose this blockade, which, as I said, is consistent and legal under international law, well, then that's an act of hostility, and therefore any notion of there being a ceasefire has really come to an end.
What about Australia's Wedgetail aircraft? Could we be drawn in to defend a blockade like this?
Well, yes, there's the possibility that that could be the case, but we know that the government have said that the deployment of the Wedgetail is very much as a defensive asset, and a defensive asset in association with the UAE. This proposed action by the United States in terms of commencing a blockade is really an offensive action, and therefore any engagement by Australia would be seeing Australia very much engaged actively in the hostilities in terms of enforcing a blockade against Iran.
Could it lead to open combat in the Strait of Hormuz?
Oh, very much so. And to that end, it depends upon Iran's ability to really respond to this. And we've had a lot of commentary by the United States over the last few weeks about Iran's naval capability being significantly decimated. But there's also a way in which you can harass vessels at sea through drones and aircraft, of course. But we just don't have a clear sense at the moment as to Iran's ability to really engage the US Navy in the Persian Gulf and in the Strait.
The blockade is in part designed to stop Iran's allies from getting oil through the Strait too. What does it mean for countries like China and Russia?
Yeah, well, I think that's really important, especially with respect to China, because we know that while there has been some vessels navigating out of the Strait of Hormuz over the last few weeks, quite a number of those have been apparently bound for China. So China has been receiving some oil, but if this blockade is successful, and it's very much focused, of course, on Iran, as we said, that would really turn off the tap in terms of that flow of oil coming to anyone, but also to China.
Trump also threatened, and this is really interesting, that vessels that pay the toll that Iran has imposed will also be targeted. What do you make of that?
Well, to a degree, I think that's just consistent with the imposition of the blockade, because the blockade is very much targeted at all vessels that are entering and exiting Iranian ports. Whether there are any other vessels in the Gulf that are seeking to exit the strait who may have paid a toll to the IRGC, we can only speculate on that. There have certainly been reports on some tolls being paid over the course of the last few weeks. How the United States would have any intelligence about that, I'm not quite clear. But it suggests that there's a wider scope for that, but as I said, how that would be actually enforced, I just can't really contemplate.
Now, Australia has said that it hasn't had a request to be part of this, but even if it has a request, the Cabinet Minister, Pat Conroy, told me earlier that Australia would not consider that request. We have a position not to be part of this. Is that like legally reasonable that Australia is steering clear of this?
Oh, most certainly. And I think we need to make a distinction between the statements that Richard Miles, the Defence Minister, has made, and also we saw evidence a week or so back in which Penny Wong was directly engaging in UK-led talks for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. That needs to be completely separated from the current talks about a blockade. So a blockade will only be effective if it's militarily enforced by military assets. So to that end, any engagement by Australia, as I said earlier, would effectively be seeing Australia become a belligerent, an active part in the conflict, in a way at the moment where, while Australia is providing defensive assistance to the UAE through the deployment of the Wedgetail, to a degree it's at arm's length from the active combat that's occurring. So I think that distinction needs to be made. Australia is very willing and happy to be engaged in ongoing political, diplomatic and defence discussions about how the strait could be reopened, but we're not really at that phase at the moment, and especially, of course, if the United States is seeking to blockade Iranian ports.
How long do you think the US can sustain a blockade like this? Would it need assistance from other like-minded countries?
Yeah, that I think will be quite a challenge, because we know that the United States imposed a blockade in and around the Venezuelan coast back in December and early January, but that was much more of an open water situation, and of course the United States was able to fairly easily send its naval assets into those waters. This is a much more difficult situation because the strait is much more contained. It's also navigationally quite challenging for vessels. On the other hand, a smaller fleet of US vessels may well be able to properly operate and enforce the blockade. So there's a whole range of dynamics. We also know that over the course of the last week, the United States has been gathering a lot of military assets generally within the region. So I don't have a clear sense of their capability, but there are multiple dynamics at play here in terms of how ultimately this could be enforced, both at sea and in the air.
We have a new Chief of the Defence Force. Admiral Hammond has been appointed. He was asked about Australia's capability and said we were capable. Now, of course, you know, the government would have to make a determination if we deploy. But do you agree with that assessment, that we are actually able to help if asked?
Well, we are actually helping at the moment through the deployment of the Wedgetail. So I think the discussion at the moment is how much further can we go? And I think that the consistent line coming out from our defence hierarchy is that, yes, we have the capability to be able to respond, but ultimately whether we respond is a political decision that needs to be made by the Albanese government. But at face value, the Australian Defence Force always has to be available to respond to any government request to deploy defence assets in multiple different situations overseas, whether it's a peacekeeping mission, a humanitarian mission, or whether it's a combat operation or a peace enforcement operation in an active military defence zone.
Don Rothwell, always great to get your thoughts. Thank you.
You're welcome, Patricia.